Blew my wife's fox fur to shreds.
I wonder if she fainted dead away.
I caught her just in time.
Sometimes, Hollywood stories come with a kind of behind-the-scenes drama that's way juicier than anything on screen. That's exactly what happened with Nancy Kulp and Buddy Ebsen. Their story is one of those you just can't help but lean in closer to hear. It's filled with tension, misunderstandings, and personalities that clashed long before the Beverly Hillbillies put them together on one of the most iconic sitcoms of all time. Nancy Kulp wasn't your typical Hollywood actress. Born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, she was an only child, raised by her father, Robert, who traveled constantly as a salesman, and her mother, Marjorie, who taught school and later became a principal. Nancy's childhood was structured, focused on education and hard work. When her family moved to Miami, she brought that same determination with her. By 1943, Nancy had earned a degree in journalism and was ready to make her mark, not in front of the camera, but behind it, writing stories. And write she did. Nancy worked for a paper called the Miami Beach Tropics, and she wasn't just scribbling local news. She interviewed huge names like Clark Gable and even royalty like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. She was building a name for herself, no doubt about it. But then World War II came along and Nancy felt the call to serve. Without hesitation, she joined the U.S. Naval Reserve. Imagine her, young and full of drive, donning her uniform and earning the rank of lieutenant. That determination never left her. On the flip side, Buddy Ebsen was cut from an entirely different cloth. Born and raised in Orlando, Florida, Buddy's dream was to dance. He and his sister Vilma performed in vaudeville, known as the Baby Astairs. Buddy had a natural charm that made people love him. But his early career wasn't all smooth sailing. When he arrived in New York, he was flat broke, barely able to afford food. He hustled, though, and eventually found his way to Broadway. From there, Hollywood came knocking. Buddy made a name for himself dancing in musicals, even partnering with Shirley Temple on screen. And here's a fun fact. Walt Disney hired him to help animate Mickey Mouse's dance moves. But not everything was picture perfect. When Buddy was cast as the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, it seemed like his big break, until the aluminum dust in the makeup landed him in the hospital. He had to drop out of the role, a crushing blow that sent his career into a bit of a tailspin. Buddy didn't let that stop him. He pivoted, teaching naval officers during the war and later exploring roles in westerns, dramas, and comedies. His laid-back, folksy vibe made him a favorite, even if he hadn't landed that one role to cement his stardom. At least, not yet. By the late 1950s, Nancy and Buddy were moving through the same Hollywood circles, though their paths hadn't quite crossed. Nancy was carving out her space with small but memorable roles on shows like I Love Lucy and Maverick. She wasn't the kind of actress who played glamorous leading ladies, and she knew it. Instead, she leaned into quirky, scene-stealing characters. Her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude made her stand out. Buddy, meanwhile, was the dependable everyman. He played charming villains, grizzled cowboys, and anything else that came his way. His career might not have been flashy, but he was steady, the kind of guy directors liked having on set. People saw him as easygoing and professional, a stark contrast to Nancy's bold, outspoken personality. By the time the early 1960s rolled around, both Nancy and Buddy had built respectable careers, but neither had found their breakout role. That's when fate, or maybe just Hollywood, threw them together on the Beverly Hillbillies. The show exploded onto TV screens, a massive hit right out of the gate. Audiences fell in love with the Clampetts, this backwoods family stumbling their way through the glitz and glamour of Beverly Hills. Nancy played Miss Hathaway, the sharp, uptight secretary to the bumbling banker Mr. Drysdale. Her performance was pitch perfect, delivering comedy gold with her stiff posture and deadpan delivery. On the other hand, Buddy became Jed Clampett, the kind-hearted patriarch of the family. His folksy wisdom and gentle demeanor made him the heart of the show. From the outside, it looked like they were the perfect ensemble. But behind the scenes, it was a whole different story. Nancy and Buddy's personalities couldn't have been more opposite. Nancy was smart, opinionated, and progressive in her views. Buddy was more old-fashioned, sticking to traditional values and an easygoing demeanor that masked some deeply held beliefs. They clashed, big time, and that's where things got juicy. This wasn't just some petty argument or Hollywood squabble. The animosity brewing between Nancy Kulp and Buddy Ebsen was deep, and you could feel it under the surface. It was like a storm that just kept building, and something had to give sooner or later. When the creators of the Beverly Hillbillies were putting together the cast, they had a clear vision for each character. They needed someone sharp and unique to play Jane Hathaway, the no-nonsense secretary who worked for the Clampetts' banker, Mr. Drysdale. Miss Jane was efficient, smart, and a bit eccentric, with her love of birdwatching and her unshakable loyalty to her boss. Nancy Kulp was a perfect fit. She brought a mix of charm and wit that made Miss Jane not just another supporting character, but someone viewers adored. By this time, Buddy Ebsen was already well known in Hollywood. His laid-back style and knack for playing wise, fatherly roles made him an easy pick for Jed Clampett. Jed was the heart of the Clampett family, a simple man with good old-fashioned common sense. Buddy's warm personality shone through, making Jed someone you wanted to invite over for dinner, or maybe ask for advice. He had that calm presence that made you trust him, even when chaos surrounded him. When the show premiered, it was like lightning in a bottle. People loved it. The idea of a poor family from the Ozarks stumbling into a life of luxury after striking oil was irresistible. The Clampetts were funny, lovable, and relatable in a way that just worked. They didn't fit into Beverly Hills, but that was the point. Their simple ways clashing with the high society around them led to hilarious moments that kept viewers hooked week after week. Nancy's character, Miss Jane, quickly became a standout. She was more than just a secretary. She cared about the Clampetts, often standing up for them when Mr. Drysdale's greed got out of hand. And if you remember the show, you'll know Miss Jane had a soft spot for Jethro, Jed's clueless but good-natured nephew. Nancy played the role with just the right mix of humor and heart, and her performance earned her an Emmy nomination. She made Miss Jane unforgettable. Buddy's portrayal of Jed was just as iconic. He was the glue holding the family together. While Granny stirred the pot with her wild schemes, Ellie Mae charmed everyone with her innocence, and Jethro caused trouble without meaning to. Jed stayed calm. His famous catchphrase, "Well, all doggies," became a part of pop culture. Buddy's ability to bring warmth and depth to Jed made the character more than just a backwoods stereotype. He was the steady, guiding hand in the middle of all the craziness. On screen, Nancy and Buddy's characters had a friendly, almost sweet relationship. Off-screen, it was a completely different story. The two couldn't have been more opposite in their views and personalities, and that's where the real tension came from. Buddy was a proud conservative, and he wasn't shy about sharing his opinions. Nancy, on the other hand, was progressive and outspoken. It wasn't just a mild difference of opinion. It was like oil and water. They didn't mix. Nancy had a sharp mind and wasn't afraid to challenge Buddy, and Buddy wasn't the type to back down easily. Their arguments went far beyond the usual Hollywood gossip. These were serious debates, and they weren't exactly quiet about it. Some of the other cast members later talked about how heated things got. Donna Douglas, who played Ellie Mae, once said Nancy and Buddy could go back and forth for weeks over their differences. Imagine being on that set, watching these two go at it while still having to act like best friends for the cameras. It must have been intense. But here's the thing. They were both professionals. No matter how much they butted heads behind the scenes, they showed up, hit their marks, and delivered performances that helped make the Beverly Hillbillies a smash hit. The audience never saw the tension. All they saw was the magic on screen. Nancy's Miss Jane became one of the most beloved characters on the show. She wasn't glamorous or flashy, but that's what made her relatable. She was the person who tried to do the right thing, even when everyone else around her was a little ridiculous. And while her crush on Jethro was mostly played for laughs, it added a sweet human touch to her character. Buddy's Jed, meanwhile, was the kind of role you couldn't imagine anyone else playing. He brought the Clampetts' values to life in a way that felt authentic. Whether he was trying to figure out how to deal with Beverly Hills' fancy ways or just keeping his family grounded, Jed was the calm in the storm. People tuned in every week, not just for the laughs but for the comfort of seeing Jed navigate the madness with his unshakable sense of self. But no amount of success could erase the tension between Nancy and Buddy. In fact, as the show went on, some say the divide between them only got worse. What made it even harder was how closely they had to work together. As Miss Jane and Jed, they shared a lot of scenes. On the surface they smiled and delivered their lines, but anyone paying attention might have noticed an undercurrent of something more. It was subtle, but it was there. And the show's success only added pressure. The Beverly Hillbillies wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. Millions of people tuned in every week, laughing at the antics of the Clampetts as they stumbled through the glitzy world of Beverly Hills. Being the #1 show on TV came with all kinds of challenges. It amplified everything, including the good, the bad, and especially the cracks in working relationships. For Nancy Kulp and Buddy Ebsen, those cracks were impossible to ignore. When the show ended, it cemented its place in TV history. People loved it, and they still talk about it today. But for Nancy and Buddy, the end of the show wasn't the end of their story. Their differences, which had simmered under the surface for years, didn't just disappear. If anything, they followed them into the next chapters of their lives. Nancy was always someone who looked for the next challenge, and after the Beverly Hillbillies, she decided to take a completely new path. By 1984, she set her sights on politics. At 62 years old, Nancy announced she was running for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. It might have seemed like a big leap, but Nancy believed she had something to offer. If Ronald Reagan could go from Hollywood to politics, why not her? She had always been outspoken and passionate, and she thought she could bring those qualities to public service. She ran as a Democrat in Pennsylvania's 9th Congressional District. It was no easy task. The district was solidly Republican, and her opponent, Bud Shuster, was a political heavyweight. He'd already been in Congress for 6 terms and had a strong base of support. Nancy wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, though. She threw herself into the campaign, meeting voters, sharing her ideas, and trying to connect with the people in her district. She knew the odds were against her, but she wasn't afraid to fight. What she didn't expect was Buddy Ebsen stepping into the picture and not on her side. Buddy, who had no connection to Pennsylvania, decided to weigh in on the race. He recorded a radio ad supporting her opponent, Bud Shuster. In the ad, Buddy called Nancy too liberal and accused her of using her fame to gain an advantage. It wasn't just a political disagreement, it felt personal. Nancy was blindsided. She and Buddy had clashed during their years on the Beverly Hillbillies, but this was something else entirely. To Nancy, it felt like a betrayal. They hadn't been friends, but she never imagined he would go out of his way to interfere in her campaign. In interviews later, she didn't hold back her feelings. She said Buddy had no business getting involved and that his actions were completely unnecessary. She called him out for trying to paint her as something she wasn't, and you could tell how much it stung. The radio ad didn't help Nancy's campaign. In fact, it might have hurt her chances. The election was tough from the start, but this added another obstacle she didn't need. In the end, she lost the race by a wide margin. Her opponent, Bud Shuster, won over 66% of the vote. Nancy later said she didn't blame Buddy entirely for her loss, but it was clear his actions had left a mark. She didn't forget it, and she didn't forgive it easily. After the campaign, Nancy stepped back from the spotlight for a while. The loss had been tough, and Buddy's involvement had made it even harder. She left Pennsylvania for some time, needing space to process everything that had happened. When she did return, it wasn't with the same political ambitions. Instead, she found a new way to make an impact. Nancy turned her attention to teaching, a passion she discovered later in life. She became an artist in residence at Juniata College, a small school in Pennsylvania. There, she taught acting classes and shared her experience with students who admired her not just for her Hollywood career, but for her determination and wit. Nancy had always been someone who thrived on connecting with people, and teaching gave her the chance to do just that. Students who worked with Nancy described her as warm and inspiring. She brought humor to her lessons, making them feel at ease while also challenging them to grow. She didn't just teach them how to act, she taught them how to believe in themselves. It was clear she loved being in the classroom, surrounded by young people who were eager to learn. Nancy also found time to act in local theater productions. She never completely left her first love, and performing on stage gave her a chance to stay connected to her roots. Every now and then she would pop up on TV for a guest appearance, but for the most part, her focus was on her students and her community. Nancy seemed to have found a kind of peace in this new chapter of her life. But life had one more challenge in store for her. In 1990, Nancy was diagnosed with cancer. True to her nature, she faced it with strength and grace. She continued teaching and stayed active in her community for as long as she could. Those who knew her during this time described her as brave and determined, qualities she had shown throughout her life. Nancy passed away in 1991, leaving behind a legacy that went far beyond the Beverly Hillbillies. She lived a life full of courage, creativity, and determination, always willing to take risks and explore new paths. While her story came to a close, Buddy Ebsen's journey continued, following a very different road in his later years. After the Beverly Hillbillies ended, Buddy kept busy in Hollywood, though his work started slowing down as he got older. He landed another memorable role as the star of Barnaby Jones, a detective series that ran for several years. The show was a hit and kept Buddy in the public eye for much of the 1970s. But no matter what he did, fans always saw him as Jed Clampett. That character, with his homespun charm and unforgettable "well, doggies" catchphrase, had become larger than life. Buddy didn't seem to mind the association too much, or at least he didn't show it. He embraced the love fans had for Jed, often attending events and interviews where he shared fond memories of the show. But there's no doubt it had its challenges. Imagine building a long and varied career, only to have people remember you for just one role. Still, Buddy handled it with his usual grace, knowing how much joy the Beverly Hillbillies had brought to people. In his later years, Buddy explored other passions that had nothing to do with acting. He loved sailing and spent much of his free time out on the water. He also tried his hand at writing, publishing a memoir where he reflected on his career and life in Hollywood. He even touched on his feud with Nancy Kulp, offering his side of the story. For Buddy, writing seemed to be a way to stay creative and share his perspective with the world. Buddy also wrote novels, which gave him another outlet for his storytelling talents. He was always a man of many interests, and even as the spotlight faded, he kept finding ways to stay active and engaged. At home, Buddy enjoyed a long and happy marriage with his third wife, Dorothy Knott. He spent his later years surrounded by family, living a life that, while quieter than his Hollywood days, was still full of warmth and love. Buddy lived to the remarkable age of 95, passing away in 2003. By then, he had outlived most of his contemporaries and stood as one of the last links to the golden age of television. His passing marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on. Through countless reruns of the Beverly Hillbillies and the memories of those who worked with him, Buddy left an undeniable mark on entertainment history. Looking back, the story of Nancy Kulp and Buddy Ebsen feels like a clash of two strong personalities who couldn't find a way to meet in the middle. They were both passionate, talented, and determined, and those qualities made them great at what they did, but also made their relationship difficult. Despite their differences, it's clear that the magic they created together as Jed Clampett and Miss Jane Hathaway brought joy to millions. That magic is what endures, even long after the cameras stopped rolling. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Hollywood's most memorable behind-the-scenes stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Let us know in the comments what other classic TV stories you'd like to hear about next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.